At our family reunion, I walked in with a smile, only for my uncle to sneer, "We didn't think you'd show your face after all your failures." The laughter that followed cut deeper than any knife, and in that moment, I knew exactly whose smile I'd be erasing first. I, 32M, stood outside the country club entrance, adjusting my tie one last time before stepping through those mahogany doors. 5 years. 5 years since I'd seen most of these people, and the knot in my stomach reminded me exactly why I'd stayed away. But today was different. Today, I wasn't the same person who'd left. The grand ballroom buzzed with familiar voices, expensive cologne, and the clink of champagne glasses. My family had always been about appearances, old money, new attitudes, and an obsession with success that bordered on religious. I scanned the room, recognizing faces that had once mattered to me. Some nodded politely. Others looked away. Then I saw him. My uncle held court near the bar, surrounded by cousins and their spouses, his booming laugh carrying across the room like it always had. He was the patriarch now, the one who controlled the family trust, the business connections, the whole empire my grandfather had built. And he'd made it abundantly clear 5 years ago that I had no place in any of it. I walked toward the bar, keeping my expression neutral. My aunt spotted me first, her eyes widening slightly before she whispered something to my uncle. He turned, and that familiar sneer spread across his face like oil on water. He announced loudly that he hadn't expected me to show my face after all my failures. The conversation around us died. Heads turned. Someone laughed nervously, then others joined in, that cruel pack mentality that wealthy families perfect over generations. My cousin smirked into her glass. My uncle's business partner chuckled and shook his head. The laughter cut through me, sharp and deliberate. But I smiled. I smiled because I'd spent 5 years preparing for this exact moment, and they had no idea what was coming. I told him it was good to see him too. That family was important. The response seemed to disappoint him. He'd wanted a scene, wanted me to slink away like I had before. Instead, I excused myself to greet my parents. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering that she was glad I'd come. My father shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't ready to give yet. They'd tried to stay neutral during the fallout 5 years ago, but neutrality in my family meant siding with power, and power meant my uncle. The reunion progressed, as these things always did. Speeches about family legacy, toasts to absent members, the usual performance. I made small talk, reconnected with a few genuine relatives who'd never participated in the mockery, and waited. Patience had been my hardest lesson to learn, but I'd learned it well. My uncle found me again near the dessert table. He asked if I was still playing at being an entrepreneur, the condescension thick in his voice. He mentioned that real success took more than ideas and desperation, that it took breeding, connections, the things I'd thrown away when I'd refused to join the family business on his terms. I told him I'd learned a lot in 5 years. He laughed and said clearly not enough, gesturing at my off-the-rack suit compared to his custom Italian tailoring. He walked away, and I watched him go, counting down in my head. 3 hours later, his phone rang. Then his business partner's phone. Then my cousin's. I watched the color drain from my uncle's face as he stepped out onto the terrace, pressing his phone to his ear, his voice rising even through the glass doors. My other cousin approached me, asking if I knew what was happening. I shrugged and suggested maybe the market was having a bad day. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression crumbled. The news was spreading fast now, exactly as I planned. 20 minutes earlier, a press release had gone live. My startup, the one I'd built from nothing after my uncle had blocked me from every family connection and professional network he controlled, had just been acquired. Not by some small player, by one of the largest tech conglomerates in the country. The purchase price was substantial enough to make headlines. More importantly, the deal included my appointment as VP of Innovation for their entire operation, a position that came with significant board influence. But that was just the opening move. The second press release detailed my company's patent portfolio. We'd developed proprietary logistics software that revolutionized supply chain management, the kind of software that several major corporations had already committed to licensing, including 3 of my uncle's largest clients, who were quoted in the release praising the technology they'd be implementing. The third press release was my masterpiece. It announced a new venture capital fund I was launching with my acquisition windfall. The fund's focus was supporting entrepreneurs from non-traditional backgrounds, people who'd been shut out by the old boys network. The board of advisors included 2 executives my uncle had spent years courting, trying to bring into his orbit. They'd chosen mine instead. My uncle stormed back inside, his face purple, his carefully maintained composure shattered. He found me immediately and demanded to know why I hadn't told the family about any of this. His voice shook with barely contained rage. I reminded him that he'd made it clear 5 years ago that I wasn't really family. Not the kind that mattered. I was just the nephew who'd failed to appreciate the opportunities I'd been given, who'd wanted to do things my own way instead of his way, who'd embarrassed him by walking away from the family business. He insisted that wasn't what he'd said, but we both knew it was exactly what he'd meant. My aunt touched his arm, trying to calm him, but he shook her off. Around us, the party had gone quiet again, but this time the energy was different. This time, people were looking at their phones, at me, recalculating. My cousin who'd smirked earlier approached with a suddenly warm smile, congratulating me and mentioning how she'd always believed in me. I thanked her politely and excused myself. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. Over the next hour, I watched the social dynamics shift in real time. Relatives who'd ignored me at the bar now wanted to chat. Business associates of my uncle who'd participated in the earlier mockery now remembered previous conversations we'd supposedly had. My father gripped my shoulder, pride evident in his eyes, though I wondered where that pride had been when I'd needed it. My uncle retreated to a corner with his inner circle, making phone calls, trying to contain whatever damage he imagined this might do to his operations. The truth was, my success didn't directly threaten his business, but it destroyed something more important to him, his narrative. The story he'd told everyone about my failure, about why the old ways were better, about who deserved respect and power in our family. As the evening wore down, my mother pulled me aside. She said she knew I'd done this deliberately, that I'd timed everything for maximum impact. I asked her if she blamed me. She was quiet for a long moment, then admitted she didn't, but she wished things hadn't come to this. I told her things had come to this 5 years ago. I'd just taken time to respond. Before leaving, I approached my uncle one final time. He stood alone near the window, his earlier entourage having dispersed to manage their own concerns. I told him I wanted to say goodbye. He didn't turn around. He said I'd made my point and asked what I wanted now. Did I want an apology? His approval? A place back in the family hierarchy? I told him I didn't want anything from him. 5 years ago, when I'd walked away from his business, his connections, and his conditional love, he'd told me I'd regret it. He'd said I'd come crawling back when reality hit. He'd ensured that every door in our industry was closed to me, called in favors to make sure I couldn't get funding, and spread rumors that I was unstable, unreliable, not worth the risk. Every failure I'd had in those first 2 years, every rejection, every humiliating pitch meeting where I could see they'd already been poisoned against me, all of it traced back to him. He'd wanted me to fail so thoroughly that I'd have no choice but to accept whatever scraps he offered on his terms. But he'd miscalculated. He'd assumed that desperation would break me. Instead, it had forged me. I'd learned to succeed without the family name, without the connections, without any of the advantages I'd been born into. And in doing so, I'd built something that was actually mine. He finally turned, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked old. He asked if I was going to use my new position to come after him, to damage his business out of spite. I told him no. I didn't need to. His business would continue as it always had, solid and traditional, and slowly becoming irrelevant as the world moved on. My revenge wasn't about destroying him. It was about making him irrelevant to my story. He'd spent 5 years trying to define me by my failures. I'd just redefined myself by my success. I mentioned that I would be seeing him at future family events, that I'd be polite and professional. But he should understand that the days of him holding court while I stood in the shadows were over. The power dynamic had shifted, and we both knew it. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I found my parents on my way out. My father asked if I'd stay in touch more now, and I promised I would. My mother hugged me again, tighter this time, and whispered that she was sorry. I told her I knew. Driving home that night, I realized the revenge felt different than I'd imagined. For 5 years, I'd pictured this moment, the look on my uncle's face, the vindication. And it had been satisfying, watching him realize that his mockery had been premature, that his control had been an illusion. But it wasn't the triumph that mattered most. What mattered was that I'd proven something to myself. That I could be knocked down, shut out, laughed at, and still build something meaningful. My uncle's approval or disapproval was irrelevant. His power over my life existed only as long as I believed it did. The smile I'd erased wasn't really his. It was the smile he wore when he looked at me and saw failure, saw someone who needed him, saw someone he could control. That smile was gone now, replaced by the realization that I'd moved beyond his reach. Update 1. 3 weeks after the reunion, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was my cousin's husband, the one who'd laughed the loudest at my uncle's initial jab. He wanted to meet for coffee to discuss a potential investment opportunity. I declined politely. The requests kept coming. Distant relatives suddenly remembered business ideas they wanted to discuss. Former family friends reached out through LinkedIn. Even my uncle's business partner sent a carefully worded email about potential synergies between our operations. I ignored most of them. The ones I responded to, I kept brief and professional. I wasn't interested in becoming what my uncle had been, using family connections as leverage, keeping score of favors owed. That was his game, and I'd already won by refusing to play it. The real surprise came from my youngest cousin, barely 22, who I'd barely known before the reunion. She called and asked if we could talk, not about business, but about leaving. She'd been accepted to a graduate program across the country, something in environmental science, completely outside the family's business interests. She wanted to go, but was facing pressure to stay, to take her place in the company, to follow the path that had been laid out for her. We met at a coffee shop far from the family's usual haunts. She asked how I'd done it, how I'd walked away knowing what it would cost. I told her the truth. It had been terrifying. For the first year, I'd second-guessed myself constantly, wondered if I'd made a massive mistake, if my pride had destroyed my future. But I'd learned that fear of failure was different from actual failure. My uncle had tried to convince me they were the same thing, that stepping outside his protection guaranteed disaster. He'd been wrong. Failure was possible, even likely, but it wasn't guaranteed. And more importantly, it wasn't permanent unless I let it be. She asked if I regretted the years of struggle. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her I regretted the pain it had caused people I loved, particularly my parents who'd been caught in the middle. I regretted some of the opportunities I'd missed and the relationships that had been damaged. But I didn't regret the person I'd become. The struggle had stripped away the privilege and entitlement I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. It had forced me to develop real skills, real resilience, real empathy for people who didn't have safety nets. Those lessons were worth more than anything my uncle could have taught me. She left that meeting with tears in her eyes, but also with determination. 2 weeks later, she called to tell me she'd accepted the graduate program. Her parents were furious. My uncle had called her ungrateful, but she was going anyway. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. Real revenge, I was learning, wasn't about tearing others down. It was about building something better and showing others they could too. Update 2. The family's annual board meeting took place 6 months after the reunion. My grandfather's trust, which controlled significant family assets, required all major stakeholders to attend. I'd inherited a small percentage when I turned 30, not enough to influence decisions, but enough to require my presence. I walked into the conference room to find the usual suspects. My uncle at the head of the table, his sons flanking him, various family members, and their lawyers filling the other seats. The atmosphere was tense. Several investments had underperformed. The logistics clients I'd mentioned earlier had indeed switched to my former company's software, and while it hadn't crippled anyone, it had made the quarterly numbers look weak. My uncle ran through the agenda efficiently, avoiding eye contact with me. When we reached new business, one of his sons proposed a significant investment in a traditional manufacturing operation, the kind of safe, boring play the family had always favored. I spoke up for the first time, asking about their digital transformation strategy. The room went quiet. My uncle's son explained, with barely concealed condescension, that they'd assessed the digital market and found it too volatile for the family's risk tolerance. I pointed out that their assessment was 3 years old, that the market had matured significantly, and that their definition of risk was actually creating more vulnerability by leaving them dependent on increasingly outdated business models. I offered to share some research my team had compiled. My uncle cut in, thanking me for my input, but suggesting we stick to traditional investment theses. The family had done well for generations with their current approach, and he saw no reason to chase trends. I didn't push. Instead, I waited until the meeting concluded and approached my father privately. I asked if he'd be willing to review the research I'd mentioned, no strings attached, just as a favor. He agreed. 2 weeks later, my father called. He'd gone through the materials and had some questions. We met for lunch, just the two of us for the first time in years. He admitted he'd been following my company's trajectory, that he'd been impressed by what I'd built, but also hurt that I hadn't included him in any of it. I explained that I hadn't been trying to shut him out. I'd been trying to prove I could succeed without the family machinery behind me, not because I didn't love them, but because I needed to know I was capable. He understood, even if it still stung. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. He was tired. Tired of the board meetings, the family politics, the constant pressure to maintain appearances. He'd spent 40 years building and protecting the family legacy, and he wasn't sure anymore what it was all for. My uncle had become increasingly controlling. My mother was unhappy, and the younger generation seemed more interested in trust fund distributions than in building anything meaningful. He asked if I'd consider returning in some capacity, not under my uncle's terms, but as an independent voice on the board. He owned enough shares to push it through if I agreed. I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew my answer was no. Not because of pride or residual anger, but because going back would mean re-entering the system I'd escaped. It would mean board meetings and family politics and the slow erosion of everything I'd built independently. But I offered an alternative. I suggested he consider stepping back himself, not retiring completely, but reducing his involvement. He could take a board seat in my new venture capital fund, help guide investments, mentor entrepreneurs, use his experience to build new things rather than just preserve old ones. He looked at me like I'd suggested he join the circus. But then, slowly, I saw something shift in his expression. He asked if I was serious. I told him absolutely. The fund needed experienced guidance, and more importantly, I needed him, not as a representative of the family business, but as my father. He didn't answer right away, but the fact that he was considering it was enough. Update 3. 1 year after the reunion, I received an invitation to my uncle's 70th birthday celebration. It was a formal affair, another country club, another performance of family unity. I almost declined, but my mother called personally to ask me to attend. She said it would mean a lot to her, and despite everything, she was still my mother. I went. The party was smaller than the reunion, more intimate. My uncle's closest friends and family, none of the extended network that had witnessed my vindication. I wondered if that was intentional, a way to avoid any awkward reminders. My uncle greeted me cordially, without warmth, but without hostility. We were both capable of being civil. I congratulated him on the milestone and moved on. The evening progressed smoothly until my father stood to give a toast. He spoke about my uncle's accomplishments, his dedication to family, his business acumen. Standard birthday speech material. Then he shifted. He talked about legacy, about what we leave behind. He said that for years, he'd defined success by financial metrics, by the growth of assets under management, by the preservation of what his father had built. But lately, he'd been rethinking that definition. He looked at me. He said watching his son build something from nothing, without the family safety net, had taught him something important. Success wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about having the courage to build the future, even when the path wasn't clear, even when people you respected told you it was impossible. He announced that he was stepping down from his operational role in the family business and taking a seat on my venture capital fund's advisory board. He planned to dedicate his time to supporting entrepreneurs who reminded him of someone, and he looked at me again when he said it. The room was silent. My uncle's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. This wasn't just about business. This was about loyalty, about my father choosing my path over my uncle's, about the family fracturing in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. My mother was crying, but they were happy tears. My cousin, the one who'd gone to graduate school, squeezed my hand under the table. My uncle's sons looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to react. After the toast, my uncle approached my father. They spoke quietly in the corner, and I couldn't hear what was said. But when they finished, my uncle looked exhausted, and my father looked free. Later, as people were leaving, my uncle stopped me at the door. He told me he supposed I'd gotten what I wanted. The family divided. My father pulled away from the business, the whole careful structure he'd maintained crumbling. I told him that wasn't what I wanted at all. I'd wanted respect. I'd wanted him to acknowledge that there were multiple paths to success, that his way wasn't the only way, that rejecting his specific vision didn't mean rejecting family or values or worth. I'd spent 5 years angry, focused on proving him wrong, but I'd realized something in the process. His approval or disapproval didn't define me. His assessment of my worth was irrelevant. I'd built a life and career that made me proud, surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not what family I came from. The smile I'd wanted to erase was the one that said I needed him, that I'd fail without him. That revenge wasn't about his humiliation. It was about my liberation. He asked if we could start over somehow, find a way forward that didn't require us to be enemies. I told him honestly that I didn't know. The hurt ran deep, and trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to fully repair. But I was willing to try civility, maybe even collaboration on projects where our interests aligned. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was movement, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. I drove home that night thinking about the reunion, about standing in that ballroom listening to laughter at my expense. I'd promised myself I'd erase his smile, and I had. But the real victory wasn't in his expression or his embarrassment or the shifting family dynamics. The real victory was in the mirror. It was in knowing that I'd been knocked down hard, that I'd been mocked and blocked and written off, and I'd gotten back up. Not for revenge, though that had motivated me. Not for approval, though some part of me had wanted it. But because I believed I could, and I'd been willing to do the work to prove it. My uncle's smile had been erased by his own realization that his power had always been an illusion. His control existed only over people who accepted it. The moment I stopped accepting it, the moment I built something independent of his influence, that control vanished. 5 years ago, I'd walked away from the family business feeling like a failure. Today, I walked away from his birthday party feeling complete. The journey between those two moments had been brutal, filled with rejection and doubt and struggle. But it had also been mine. And that, more than any business acquisition or press release or family board meeting, was the revenge that mattered. Not erasing his smile,